In January 1962, a small black-and-white comedy aired on a single channel of the British Broadcasting Corporation. It ran for 30 minutes. It was the fourth episode of an anthology series called Comedy Playhouse. It was called The Offer. By the time it had ended, the British public had been introduced to two of the most enduring characters in television history: a bitter, scheming old rag-and-bone man, and his son, a dreaming, frustrated, unbearably ordinary man approaching 40 who could not escape him. The show that grew from that one half-hour episode became Steptoe and Son. It ran for 8 series. It commanded audiences of 28 million viewers. It produced 2 feature films, multiple Christmas specials, and a stage tour. It became, in the words of more than one critic, the first true British sitcom. The father and son who shared the screen, Albert and Harold, became part of the family architecture of post-war Britain. The men playing them were called Harry H. Corbett and Wilfrid Brambell. The audience laughed at them for 12 years. The audience loved them for 12 years. The audience did not know what those 12 years were doing to the men inside the costumes. The audience did not know that the man playing the unkempt, bigoted, deceitful Albert Steptoe was, in private, a cultured Irish gentleman with a secret that British law of the period would have destroyed him for. The audience did not know that the man playing the simple, weary Harold was a serious classical actor once compared to Marlon Brando, who would spend the rest of his life trying to escape the role that had made him. The two men were, by every account given by the writers of the show, professional colleagues rather than friends. They came from different generations, different countries, different traditions of acting. They had little in common off the screen, and on a long Australian tour at the end of their working partnership, the strain of being together for so many months would at times show. A persistent rumour in the years after, popularised in a Channel 4 documentary called When Steptoe Met Son, broadcast in 2002, claimed that the two actors had come to detest each other. Both the writers Ray Galton and Alan Simpson and the surviving members of the Corbett family have always rejected that version of the story. The truth, as far as it can be reconstructed from the available record, sits somewhere quieter and somewhere stranger. Both of them are gone now. The story of their actual lives, the lives that ran behind the rag-and-bone yard set in Shepherd's Bush, has rarely been told together. This is that story. The story of Steptoe and Son began not with the actors, but with 2 young writers. Ray Galton and Alan Simpson had met as teenagers in 1948 in a tuberculosis sanatorium at Milford in Surrey, where both had been sent for treatment after the disease had collapsed both their lungs. They had begun writing comedy together on a hand-typed sanatorium magazine. By the early 1950s, they had recovered, moved to London, and begun professional writing. By the second half of that decade, they had become the most successful comedy writers in British radio and television through their work for the comedian Tony Hancock on the long-running series Hancock's Half Hour. By the late 1950s, Galton and Simpson had decided to leave Hancock. The British Broadcasting Corporation offered them what no other comedy writers in Britain had been offered before: a 10-episode anthology series. Each episode would be a standalone half-hour comedy play with no continuing characters and no recurring cast. The series was called Comedy Playhouse. It began broadcasting on the 15th of December, 1961. The 4th episode of Comedy Playhouse went out on the 5th of January, 1962. It was called The Offer. It was about a young rag-and-bone man who comes home to tell his father he has been given a job offer in another rag-and-bone business in another part of London and wants to leave the family yard. The episode unfolds entirely in a single junkyard. The two men argue. The son packs his belongings into the cart. The horse will not move. The son begins, slowly, to unpack. The end of the episode finds him back where he started, defeated. The reaction was overwhelming. The British Broadcasting Corporation commissioned a full series. Steptoe and Son began as a series in its own right on the 14th of June, 1962. There were 4 series broadcast between 1962 and 1965. The show returned in 1970 after a gap of 5 years and ran for a further 4 series until December 1974. 2 feature films were produced, the first in 1972 and the second in 1973. 4 Christmas specials were broadcast across the run. The opening title music, an unforgettable Edwardian-style tuba and brass theme called Old Ned, had been composed by the Australian composer Ron Grainer, who would later write the theme to Doctor Who. At its peak in the early 1970s, an episode of Steptoe and Son could draw 28 million British viewers, more than half the adult population of the United Kingdom. The show was, by the autumn of 1964, so popular that it became briefly entangled in the politics of the country. The 1964 general election was scheduled for Thursday the 15th of October. Polling stations were due to close at 9 in the evening. The British Broadcasting Corporation had scheduled an episode of Steptoe and Son for that same Thursday evening at 8 o'clock, an hour before polls closed. The leader of the Labour Party, Harold Wilson, was campaigning to unseat the Conservative government after 13 years in opposition. Wilson visited the home of the Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation, Sir Hugh Green, and asked him personally to postpone the broadcast. His reasoning, as he later admitted, was that he believed Steptoe and Son drew its audience overwhelmingly from the working class, that the working class would stay home to watch the show rather than go out to vote, and that those working class voters were the people Labour needed at the ballot box. Sir Hugh Green agreed. The episode was pulled. Labour won the election by a majority of 4 seats. Harold Wilson became Prime Minister. He is later supposed to have said, of the favour he had asked, "That will be worth a dozen or more seats to me." The cultural reach of the show eventually crossed the Atlantic. In January 1972, the American producer Norman Lear remade the series for American television as Sanford and Son, transposing the setting from Shepherd's Bush to a junkyard in Los Angeles, recasting the 2 leads as an African-American father and son, played by the comedian Red Fox and the actor Demond Wilson, both of whom have since died. Fox in 1991, Wilson in January of this year. Sanford and Son ran for 6 seasons on NBC and became one of the most popular American sitcoms of the 1970s. The casting of the original comedy Playhouse episode broke with comedy convention. Galton and Simpson did not want comedians. They wanted serious actors, capable of playing tragedy as well as humour. They had been impressed by a 36-year-old actor of Welsh descent named Harry H. Corbett, who had been making his name in classical theatre and in serious television drama. For the role of the father, they cast a 49-year-old Irish character actor who had quietly been building a career playing old men for nearly a decade. His name was Wilfrid Brambell. Neither man knew, on the day they accepted those roles in January 1962, that they had just been cast in the parts that would define the next 20 years of their lives. Neither knew that one of them would spend those 20 years trying to escape the role, and the other would spend them hiding from his own private life. The script that arrived on their desks was a half-hour comedy play. What they were actually being given was a sentence. Harry Corbett, who would add the middle initial H to his name in the early 1950s to distinguish himself from a children's television entertainer of the same name, was born on the 28th of February 1925 in Rangoon, in what was then the British colony of Burma. He was the youngest of 7 children. His father, George Corbett, was a company quartermaster sergeant in the South Staffordshire Regiment of the British Army, posted to a colonial garrison in Asia. His mother was called Caroline Emily, formerly Caroline Barnsley. She died of dysentery when Harry Corbett was 18 months old. The infant was sent back to England, never to see Burma again, and was raised by an aunt in Wythenshawe, a working-class district on the southern edge of Manchester. The childhood that followed was one of deep poverty. The Corbett household was sustained by an aunt with very little money. The only thing that ever brought money into the house was the war itself, the tragedy of which he carried with him for the rest of his life. He was educated at Ross Place School and Benchill Primary School, both in Wythenshawe, and at Sharston Secondary School. He was taken to the Manchester Opera House as a child to see the comedian Leslie Henson. There, the spark first flew off the forge. In 1943, he was conscripted. He served in the Royal Marines through the last 2 years of the war on Home Fleet duty in the North Atlantic and was posted after victory over Japan Day in August 1945 to the Pacific, first to New Guinea and then to Tonga. His service ended eventually in Australia, where he briefly went absent without leave before turning himself in to the military police and returning to the United Kingdom. He brought home from the Pacific 2 things that would mark him for the rest of his life: a damaged bladder caused by an untreated tropical infection and a memory, recorded later in his daughter's biography of him published in 2012, of having walked through Hiroshima in 1945, weeks after the atomic bomb had ended the war. He almost never spoke of any of it. He came back to England in 1946 and trained, briefly and unsuccessfully, as a radiographer. He drifted. He wandered one afternoon into the Chorlton Repertory Company in Manchester and was offered a small part. His first professional role, in his own much-quoted phrase, was as the front legs of a cow in a pantomime. He was paid £2 10 a week. He never went back to medicine. By the early 1950s, he had begun to be noticed. He added the middle initial H to his stage name to avoid confusion with the children's puppeteer Harry Corbett, the creator of the glove puppet Sooty. The middle initial, with the full stop that became part of his stage signature, was the only thing the 2 Harry Corbetts would ever have in common. From the Chorlton Repertory Company, Harry H. Corbett moved south to London. In 1953, he was recruited by the director Joan Littlewood into her Theatre Workshop Company, which had just taken up permanent residence at the Theatre Royal in Stratford East, in the East End of London. The Theatre Workshop was the most adventurous theatre company in post-war Britain. Its acting style was based on the Russian theorist Konstantin Stanislavski, the founder of what English-speaking actors would eventually call the method. It performed Brecht. It performed Ibsen, it performed Shakespeare, it performed new political writing about the British working class. The opening production at the Theatre Royal Stratford East in February 1953 was Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Corbett played Sir Andrew Aguecheek, the foolish knight. The role of Malvolio was taken by his fellow Theatre Workshop actor George A. Cooper. He stayed at the Theatre Workshop through the early and middle 1950s, taking the leading roles in productions of Ben Jonson's The Alchemist and Shakespeare's Richard II. The Richard II performance, with Corbett in the title role, established his reputation in the British theatre as a leading classical actor of his generation. He worked alongside actors such as George A. Cooper and Maxwell Shaw. He studied the Stanislavski method seriously. He was thought, by those who saw him on the Stratford stage in those years, to be among the most exciting young actors in Britain. He made his West End debut in April 1956 at the Phoenix Theatre in London in T.S. Eliot's The Family Reunion. By the end of the 1950s, he was being described in some sections of the British press as the English Marlon Brando, in respect of his method training and the brooding, intense quality of his stage work. From 1958 onwards, he began to appear regularly in British feature films. He played supporting and leading roles in dramas such as Floods of Fear in 1958, filmed at Pinewood Studios. He appeared in television dramas including The Adventures of Robin Hood and Police Surgeon. In November 1958, he married the actress Sheila Stiefel. The marriage lasted 6 years before ending in divorce in 1964. He would marry again in 1969 to the actress Maureen Blott. The 2 of them would have 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter, Susanna Corbett, would grow up to become an actress in her own right, and would in 2012 publish the first biography of her father called The Front Legs of the Cow. The encounter that would change his life happened around the year 1960. He met the scriptwriters Ray Galton and Alan Simpson at a social gathering. He told them how much he admired their work for Tony Hancock. They remembered him. 2 years later, when they were given the Comedy Playhouse anthology series, they sent him the script for The Offer. The decision to accept the role of Harold Steptoe in The Offer was, in his own family's later view, the single most consequential decision of his life. It made him a household name across the United Kingdom. It made him wealthy. It made him, for the rest of his life, one face, one voice, one role. The serious classical actor who had played Richard II in Stratford East would never again be allowed by the British public to play anything but a melancholy rag-and-bone man in a flat cap. The phrase that he used in private, repeatedly in the years that followed, was that he had been crucified by Steptoe. The actor who walked onto the same set in January 1962 to play Harold Steptoe's vicious old father had been alive for almost half a century before that day. His full name was Henry Wilfrid Brambell, and he was born on the 22nd of March 1912, a suburb of Dublin, when Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom. He was the youngest of 3 sons. His father, Henry Lytton Brambell, was a cashier at the Guinness Brewery, the institution that dominated the city's economy for the whole of his lifetime. His mother, formerly Edith Marks, had been an opera singer before her marriage. His very first appearance as a performer, recorded in his own autobiography All Above Board, published in 1976, was at the age of 2, brought out by his mother to entertain wounded British soldiers returning from the trenches of the First World War. In 1919, when Wilfrid Brambell was 7, his parents separated. The family was effectively broken. He went to live with his father in the Dublin port town of Kingstown, which would shortly afterwards be renamed Dunleary. He was raised through the rest of his childhood by an aunt called Louisa. He was educated at Kingstown Grammar School. He left school in his late teens, attended the Abbey School of Acting in Dublin, and began acting at the Abbey Theatre and the Gate Theatre, the 2 great Dublin theatrical institutions of the period. He supported himself for nearly 13 years as a semi-professional actor by working in the daytime as a junior reporter for the Irish Times. When the Second World War broke out, he crossed the Irish Sea to England. He joined the Entertainment's National Service Association, the British organisation that sent civilian performers to entertain troops overseas, and toured in their concert parties through the war years. In December 1944, he was released from his Entertainment's National Service Association contract in order to return briefly to Dublin, where he replaced an indisposed Jimmy O'Dea as the principal comic role of Buttons in a production of Cinderella at the Gaiety Theatre. He was a great success in the part, and Jimmy O'Dea afterwards publicly praised his comic timing. By the war's end, he was recognised in the Dublin theatrical community as one of the most promising young comic actors on the Irish stage. After the war, he went to England and went through many lean years working in odd jobs before he secured regular employment with the Swansea Repertory Company. His gaunt face and his unusually thin build led him, from his late 40s onwards, to specialise in playing old men. He took small character roles in dozens of British films through the 1950s. He began to be cast in early British television. He appeared in 3 productions for the British Broadcasting Corporation by the producer Rudolph Cartier and the writer Nigel Neal, the science fiction serial The Quatermass Experiment in 1953, the Cartier adaptation of 1984 in 1954, and Quatermass 2 in 1955, all 3 productions in which his face, even in his early 40s, was already being used to play the elderly. There is, in the early careers of the 2 men who would one day stand opposite each other on the Steptoe set, an unnoticed parallel. In Dublin, in the 1930s and 1940s, Wilfrid Brambell had been a serious Shakespearean and classical actor working at the Abbey and the Gate with a particular gift recorded in his entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography for the plays of George Bernard Shaw. He was recognised as one of the most promising young actors on the Dublin stage. In London in 1953, a 28-year-old Harry H. Corbett had stepped onto the Theatre Royal Stratford East to open Joan Littlewood's permanent company. Both men, before they had ever heard the name Albert Steptoe, were classical actors who could carry a Shakespearean comedy or a Shaw drama. Both would find, in the early 1960s, that the most successful 12 years of their working lives would not be spent at the Abbey or at Stratford East, but in a junkyard set in Shepherd's Bush. He played two particularly memorable parts in single dramas on the British Broadcasting Corporation in the early 1960s, Too Many Mansions and No Fixed Abode, both of which cast him as homeless or destitute old men. It was those two performances that brought him to the attention of Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, looking for the actor who could play Albert Steptoe. In 1948, he had married a young woman named Mary Hall. The marriage ended in divorce in 1955. The reason for the divorce, recorded openly in the autobiography he would publish 21 years later, was that his wife had taken up with a lodger they had been keeping in the house, and in 1953 had borne the lodger a child. The marriage produced no children of its own. Wilfrid Brambell would never marry again. He would live for the rest of his life alone. He was, beneath everything, a homosexual man. In Ireland in 1912, in the Britain of the 1930s to 1950s, that was a fact that could not be spoken. Homosexuality was a criminal offence under English law. Brambell hid it. He continued to hide it after he became famous. The exception, when it came, would nearly cost him everything. The international fame of Steptoe and Son brought Wilfrid Brambell one other piece of work that would carry his face beyond Britain. In April 1964, while still filming the third series of Steptoe and Son, he was cast in the first feature film of the most famous popular group in the world. The film was called A Hard Day's Night. The group was the Beatles. Wilfrid Brambell played the fictional grandfather of Paul McCartney. The screenplay, written by the Liverpool playwright Alan Owen, contained a running joke that British audiences understood instantly and American audiences did not. In Steptoe and Son, Harold called his father, on average, once an episode, a dirty old man. In A Hard Day's Night, every character who meets Paul's grandfather remarks on the same observation in the opposite direction. He is described again and again as a very clean old man, very clean indeed. The joke was an in-reference to Brambell's own Steptoe character, written into the script deliberately by Owen, knowing the British audience would catch it. Almost nobody outside Britain did. The film opened at the Pavilion Theatre in London on the 6th of July 1964. It grossed $14 million American on a production budget of £189,000. Brambell was, by the early 1960s, also being watched. The Metropolitan Police of the period maintained, in the unofficial Vice Files of the Public Morality Branch, a long list of men suspected of being secretly homosexual. With Brambell now elevated to the status of a major television celebrity, his potential value as a high-profile arrest had grown in proportion to his fame. He was, when he stepped out of Television Centre on the evening of the 6th of November 1962, walking into a trap. By the autumn of 1962, Steptoe and Son was the most discussed comedy on British television. The comedy playhouse pilot, The Offer, had been broadcast in January. The first full series of Steptoe and Son had begun on the 14th of June. By November, the show was watched, week after week, by millions of people. Wilfrid Brambell was, in the space of less than a year, a household figure. On the evening of the 6th of November 1962, Brambell left a British Broadcasting Corporation cocktail party at Television Centre in West London. He had been drinking heavily. He walked out into the streets of Shepherd's Bush. By 11:20 in the evening, he was on Shepherd's Bush Green, a triangular open space of grass and trees at the centre of the district, surrounded by busy roads. He used the public lavatories on the green twice within a 20-minute period. He was being watched by two plainclothes Metropolitan Police officers. One of them, a sergeant called Vivian Allen, had been keeping the lavatories under observation as part of the local vice squad's standing operation against suspected homosexual activity on the Green. At 11:20 p.m., Sergeant Vivian Allen approached him and arrested him. The charge was importuning for an immoral purpose under the Sexual Offences Act of 1956, the formal English legal language for the act of approaching another man with what the law of the period considered an indecent intention. The case came to court on the 12th of December 1962 in front of the West London magistrate Seymour Collins. Brambell pleaded not guilty. His defence, presented by the barrister Wilfrid Fordham, was that he had been drunk after the cocktail party, that he had been looking for a taxi to take him home, and that he had used the lavatories because he genuinely needed them. The prosecution case, presented by a barrister named Quentin Edwards, was remarkable for what it was forced to admit. It was not being alleged that Brambell had importuned by word, or by touch, or by physically approaching anybody. The claim was that he had done so by, in the prosecution's exact words, looking, staring, and smiling at the other men using the lavatories. Wilfrid Fordham, for the defence, raised the practical question of how the police, standing outside the buildings, could possibly have observed sustained smiling through small frosted windows set high in the walls. Brambell then made the statement from the witness stand that became one of the most painful public declarations of any actor of his generation. In court, in front of journalists, the words came out flat and final. "I am not a homosexual. The very thought disgusts me." The British press of the period reported the words verbatim. Both halves of the courtroom knew the statement was a lie. The journalists in the gallery knew. The Metropolitan Police knew. The magistrate Seymour Collins did not entirely believe it. He ruled that the matter was proved. Brambell was found guilty. The sentence handed down was a conditional discharge for a period of 12 months and an order to pay 25 guineas towards the costs of the prosecution. The conditional discharge meant that, provided he committed no further offence in the next year, no criminal sentence would be imposed. The cost was something else entirely. Relations between adult men of the kind the Crown had accused him of seeking would not become legal in England and Wales until the Sexual Offences Act of the 27th of July, 1967, almost 5 years later. The character he was, by that November, becoming nationally famous for playing, the dirty, leering, fiercely heterosexual Albert Steptoe, was the precise public mask he could not afford to lose. He kept the role. The British Broadcasting Corporation kept him on. The British public, mostly, did not connect the small newspaper paragraphs about a court case in West London with the actor whose face they were now watching on Saturday nights. Steptoe and Son continued. So did the quiet, careful, hidden private life of the man playing Albert. The relationship between Harry H. Corbett and Wilfrid Brambell off-screen has been the subject of a great deal of speculation, and not all of it grounded in fact. The popular legend, which hardened over the decades into something resembling an accepted truth, was that the two men hated each other. The legend has a single identifiable source. In 2002, more than a quarter of a century after the last episode of Steptoe and Son had been filmed, Channel 4 broadcast a documentary film called When Steptoe Met Son. The film argued that the two actors had detested each other, that they had been barely on speaking terms after the Australian tour, that the central evidence of the rift was the fact of the two men returning to England on separate planes. The version offered by Channel 4 was rejected, at the time and afterwards, by every surviving witness. Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, the writers, dismissed the idea of any real hatred or sustained conflict. A nephew of Harry H. Corbett issued a public statement that addressed the central claim directly. The statement, quoted in the British press at the time, said that the actors had not fallen out, that they had been together in Australia for nearly a year, that they had taken several sightseeing trips together, and that the two men had returned on different planes because Harry Corbett had been going on a family holiday at the end of the tour. not because he had refused to fly with his co-star. The truth, recorded by the show's writers and the actors' own families, was simpler and quieter than the legend. The two men came from different worlds. Corbett, the Manchester-raised Stanislavski-trained classical actor, used the rehearsal period to question and examine every line. Brambell, the older Dublin-trained working professional, preferred to learn the lines as written and deliver them. They quarrelled occasionally on professional matters. By the time of the Australian tour, Brambell was drinking heavily, and the difficulty of being on the road together for so many months put real strain on a working relationship that had never been a personal friendship. What the legend had concealed was what came afterwards. The two men did not stop working together. They returned after the tour to British radio. They appeared together in commercial advertisements. In the spring of 1978, only months after the supposed catastrophic falling out, they recorded a short comedy sketch for the British Broadcasting Corporation radio service called Scotch on the Rocks. They settled their differences, on the writer's later testimony, fairly amicably. The two men were, in the end, what they had always been: colleagues, not friends; civil, not close. The Australian tour had been hard. The story that they had hated each other was, on the testimony of those who actually knew them, never quite true. After the Australian tour, Corbett and Brambell saw each other rarely. The Steptoe and Son revival of 1970 to 1974 had been the peak of their fame and the deepest entrenchment of the trap. Both men, separately, tried to do other work. Corbett took small parts in low-budget British comedy films and television guest spots that were, by the assessment of his daughter's biography of him, well beneath what he could do. Brambell toured in light theatrical productions and accepted whatever supporting roles came his way. The one substantial film role that came to Corbett during the years of Steptoe and Son arrived in 1966, between the original 4 series and the eventual revival. It was the lead role in the 8th film of the Carry On series, Carry On Screaming. The producer Peter Rogers and the director Gerald Thomas had originally written the part of Detective Sergeant Sidney Bung for Sid James, who was unavailable. They cast Corbett in his place. The fee they paid him was £12,000, the highest single fee any Carry On actor had been paid to that point. The cast around him included Kenneth Williams, Charles Hawtrey, Jim Dale, Bernard Breslaw, Peter Butterworth, and, in a memorable cameo, the comedian John Pertwee, whose own career had begun 21 years earlier in the cast of Eric Barker's British Broadcasting Corporation Navy radio show HMS Waterlogged. Carry On Screaming would be the most successful single film performance Corbett ever gave outside Steptoe and Son. It would also be his only Carry On. In 1976, Corbett was awarded the Officer of the Order of the British Empire in the Queen's New Year Honours List. The award had been intended for him by Prime Minister Harold Wilson, a supporter of the Labour Party, which Corbett had quietly supported all his adult life. There was, by a coincidence almost too painful to invent, an administrative confusion. The civil servant compiling the list dropped the middle initial H. The first letter went out by mistake to the other Harry Corbett, the children's puppeteer behind Sooty. In the end, both men were awarded the Officer of the Order of the British Empire in the same honours list. Corbett had bought a cottage at Penhurst, a small village in East Sussex, in 1972, and had moved his family there permanently in 1977. In September 1979, he suffered his first heart attack at the cottage. He was driven to St Helens Hospital in Hastings, where his heart was stabilised. He had been smoking 60 cigarettes a day for years. After the heart attack, he cut the smoking to 20 a day, but the damage was done. Within 2 days of being discharged from hospital, he was on stage in pantomime at the Churchill Theatre in Bromley, southeast London. He continued to raise money for St Helens Hospital, the institution he believed had saved his life. He continued to work through the early 1980s. He appeared with Brambell one final time in a television advertisement for Kenco Coffee in which the two of them played Albert and Harold one last time. He filmed an episode of the Anglia anthology series Tales of the Unexpected called The Moles. On the 21st of March 1982, at his cottage in Penhurst, he suffered a second heart attack. He was rushed to St. Helens Hospital in Hastings. It was fatal. He was 57 years old. His memorial service was held on the 29th of April 1982 at St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden, the Actors' Church of London. Wilfrid Brambell attended. The two men who had toured Australia together 5 years earlier and who had then quietly returned to working together on radio and in advertisements were now, after one of them had gone, in the same room again. When Brambell spoke about his lost co-star, his composure broke. He had, by some accounts of those present, been weeping before he reached the lectern. The episode of Tales of the Unexpected that Corbett had just finished filming aired some weeks later, his face, by then, already gone. He was buried in the churchyard of St. Michael the Archangel at Penhurst, East Sussex. The inscription on his headstone, chosen by his widow Maureen, was 4 lines taken from Shakespeare's 74th sonnet. "The earth can have but earth, which is his due. My spirit is thine, the better part of me." Brambell outlived him by nearly 3 years. He had moved, by the late 1970s, into a flat in Pimlico in central London. He had also, by then, met the man with whom he would spend the rest of his life. The partner was a young Malayan man, and the relationship, which was kept quietly out of the press, lasted approximately 20 years. The Malayan partner lived with Brambell in the Pimlico flat until the actor's death. In his final years, Brambell visited Hong Kong frequently, where the homosexual social scene was, by the standards of the period, relatively open. He was diagnosed with cancer in the early 1980s. He died at his Pimlico home on the 18th of January 1985. He was 72 years old. He was cremated on the 25th of January 1985 at Streatham Park Cemetery in South London. The number of mourners who attended was 6. His brother, his Malayan partner, the 2 writers of Steptoe and Son, Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, a representative of the British Broadcasting Corporation, and the widow of Harry H. Corbett. Maureen Corbett, whose husband had toured the world with the man she was now standing in a cremation chapel for, had come down to South London on a January morning to see him out. There were 28 million viewers of Steptoe and Son at its peak. There were 6 mourners at the funeral of the man who had played Albert Steptoe. In 2008, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the same broadcaster that had made the two men famous, produced a 90-minute television drama called The Curse of Steptoe. It depicted the relationship between Corbett and Brambell through the years of the show. Brambell was played by the actor Phil Davis. Corbett was played by Jason Isaacs. The drama opened up for an audience of younger viewers who had never lived through the years of Steptoe and Son, the lives that the two actors had spent so much of their public selves trying to hide. For 12 years, between the 5th of January 1962 and the 26th of December 1974, half the adult population of the United Kingdom watched 2 men in a junkyard set in Shepherd's Bush. They watched a father and a son argue, plot, betray, forgive, and argue again. They watched what was, by general agreement, one of the great achievements of British television comedy. The audience did not know what it was watching. The audience did not know that the man playing Albert Steptoe, the grimy, ungenerous, intensely heterosexual old patriarch, was a private Irish gentleman who lived alone, who had been arrested by the Metropolitan Police one night in 1962 and who had stood in a court of law and denied, on oath, who he was. The audience did not know that he would, in the second half of his life, share a flat in Pimlico with a Malayan partner for 20 years, in a relationship the British public would never read about in any newspaper. The audience did not know that the man playing the long-suffering son was a serious classical actor who had played Richard II at the Theatre Royal Stratford East and who carried, until his second heart attack at the age of 57, the lifelong conviction that the show that had made him famous had also taken from him the career he should have had. Harry H. Corbett is gone. Wilfrid Brambell is gone. Ray Galton died in 2018. Alan Simpson died in 2017. The junkyard set was struck. The rag and bone cart was put away. The theatre workshop where the actor who would be Harold Steptoe had once played Richard II now exists under a different management. The court papers from West London Magistrates Court in 1962 sit, by now, in some archive that almost no one will ever open. What remains is 8 series of a black-and-white sitcom about 2 men who could not leave each other, made by 2 men who could not stand each other, broadcast across a Britain that loved them both and knew almost nothing about either. That, in the end, is the real story of Steptoe and Son. If their lives moved you, please subscribe to Cinema Peak so the next forgotten chapter can find you when it is ready. Until then, thank you for watching.